Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going back in time, to the Italian Renaissance, a period known for like incredible artistic stuff, political intrigue, and well, let's be real, some scandalous events happened back then.
It really was an era of contradictions, I think, a time of
Yeah,
like
yeah.
huge intellectual and creative advances, but also like rampant corruption and all these power struggles going on.
Yeah, and I don't think any family embodies those contradictions more than the infamous Borgias. We're
Yeah.
talking Pope Alexander VI, his son Cesar and daughter Lucrezia. This was like a real powerful dynasty. They had
Ah,
huge influence in both the church and the politics of Italy.
Fascinating figures, right? Both admired and feared. Their names are basically synonymous with ambition, intrigue, and, oh yeah, let's not forget a good deal of debauchery.
Right. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. So
yeah.
in 1501, Cesar Borgia threw this party at the Vatican that's gone down in history as the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts.
Just the name, it brings to mind something scandalous.
It really does. And the accounts we have from that night paint a pretty wild picture. Think like 50 honest courtesans, chestnuts all over the floor,
Mm.
and prizes being given out for, uh, shall we say, certain activities.
It definitely wasn't your typical Vatican get-together.
No, not at all. So to help us navigate this historical maze, we're going to be using a few sources. First, we have this diary from Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies. He was actually at the banquet and left a surprisingly detailed account of what went down.
Burchard's diary is fascinating, but we have to remember his perspective might have been a bit biased, because of his opinions about the Borgias.
Exactly. But his account is really the closest we get to a first-hand look at this crazy event. We'll also be looking at other accounts. Some are a bit more scandalous than others to try to get a bigger picture of the banquet and the impact it had.
Multiple perspectives are so important, especially with an event as controversial as this one.
Absolutely. So let's set the scene. It's 1501, and the Borgias are at the peak of their power in Renaissance Italy. Pope Alexander VI, Cesare and Lucrezia are like major players on the political scene.
But they also had tons of enemies and were constantly being watched. Their lifestyle, very lavish. And their ruthless tactics made them both admired and feared.
And their reputation for, shall we say, enjoying life's pleasures didn't really help. So how does this banquet of chestnuts fit into the bigger story of the Borgia family and their legacy?
Well, the banquet is almost like a symbol of their excesses, right? A representation of all the decadence and corruption that a lot of people associated with their rule.
Okay, so let's dig into the details. What does Burchard actually tell us about what happened that night?
He describes this lavish dinner followed by entertainment that, well, let's just say it went beyond the usual court dances and musical performances.
Right. He mentions 50 Roman courtesans, honest courtesans, specifically, who were told to dance first clothed and then naked. Then servants come out with candles, put them on the floor, scatter chestnuts around, and the courtesans have to crawl around picking them up.
It was definitely meant to, titillate and entertain the guests, most of whom were probably high-ranking officials and members of the papal court.
And to make it even more interesting, Burchard writes that prizes were given to those who could perform the act, most often with the courtesans.
It sounds like there was a competitive element to the evening, which, from our perspective today, is pretty unsettling.
Yeah, it is, but it really shows the power dynamics at work here. These women, even though they're called honest courtesans, were ultimately there to provide a service, to be objects of amusement for these powerful men.
And that leads us to a pretty important question. Who were these honest courtesans? What was their role in society back then in the Renaissance?
I have to admit the term honest courtesan seems a little contradictory. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure, honest courtesan was a way to distinguish high-class sex workers from, common prostitutes. These women were often educated, skilled in the arts, and they moved in these elite circles. They were seen as more than just providers of sexual services. They were companions, confidants, even muses.
So they were still involved in sex work, but their social standing was a lot more complicated than we might think at first.
Exactly. Their lives were this mix of privilege and uncertainty. They could gain wealth and influence, but they were also completely dependent on the whims of their powerful patrons.
It's a reminder that even in the middle of all this opulence and extravagance, there were real people whose lives and experiences were often ignored or minimized.
And that's something we're going to keep exploring as we get deeper into the story of the Banquet of Chestnuts. It's interesting, isn't it, how these women, these honest courtesans, were navigating this really complex social scene. To really get what their presence at the banquet meant, I think we need to look at the wider context of prostitution in Renaissance Italy.
Yeah, you're right. It seems kind of strange at first glance, right? Considering the strong influence of the Catholic Church at that time.
It does, doesn't it? But The church's stance on prostitution back then was actually quite complicated. They condemned the act itself, of course, but they also acknowledged it existed. And they saw it as a way to, like, protect marriage, you
Yeah.
know, and prevent what they considered even worse sins.
So they thought of it as like a necessary evil.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
There's this quote from St. Augustine. He said prostitution was a way to stop men from corrupting good women. By that, he meant, their wives and daughters.
That's a pretty unsettling justification, to say the least. But I guess it gives us some insight into why prostitution, especially at the higher levels, was allowed to continue.
Exactly. And Thomas Aquinas, who was another important theologian at the time, he believed that without prostitution, society would just be overwhelmed with sin, and men would end up doing even worse things.
So in a way, these women were basically shouldering the burden of men's supposed inability to control themselves.
It's a complicated and honestly pretty troubling line of thinking, but it does highlight how patriarchal Renaissance society was, and how women, regardless of their social position, were often caught between all these conflicting expectations and societal pressures.
Yeah, it's so different from how we see consent and agency today, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that these theological justifications, they didn't erase the very real dangers and exploitation that these women were facing. Their lives were precarious, even at the highest levels. They depended entirely on the goodwill and whims of powerful men. And if things went wrong, they had little recourse.
It makes you wonder, right? What made these women choose this profession? Were they driven by poverty, ambition, or was it something else entirely?
That's a question historians are still trying to figure out.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, their own voices are often lost to history. We get these glimpses through court records, letters, sometimes even works of art. But getting a full understanding of their lives and their motivations is really tough.
Yeah. It's a real shame because these women were obviously intelligent and resourceful.
Yeah.
They knew how to navigate a very complex social world.
They were. And that's where historical fiction can be helpful, It allows us to kind of imagine their lives and experiences to fill in some of the gaps that history leaves us with.
Speaking of which, you mentioned a book earlier that does this, The 16th Century in 100 Women, right? There's a whole chapter about the Banquet of Chestnuts.
Yeah, it's called Unnamed Prostitute Banquet of Chestnuts. And the author, Amy License, she does a really good job of bringing the event to life through the eyes of two courtesans.
So instead of just reading about it from this detached historical viewpoint, we get to see it through their eyes, their thoughts, their emotions.
Exactly. And it's a powerful shift in perspective. It makes these women human again. It reminds us that they weren't just objects or props in this scandalous event. They were individuals with their own hopes and fears and dreams.
And I imagine it also sheds light on how complex their profession was, the choices they had to make and the challenges they faced.
It does. The book explores the power dynamics, how precarious their position was and the constant threat of exploitation. But it also shows their resilience, their intelligence, and how they could find moments of joy and connection, even in a system that often tried to dehumanize them.
Sounds like a worthwhile read for anyone who wants to understand the lives of women during this period.
I think so. It's a reminder that history isn't just about kings and popes, battles and treaties. It's also about the everyday lives of regular people, their struggles, their triumphs, their humanity.
And sometimes those stories are best told through the lens of imagination. Guided by the bits and pieces of evidence that we have from the past.
Absolutely. And with the Banquet of Chestnuts, I think by imagining the perspectives of the women involved, we can gain a much deeper and I think more compassionate understanding of this controversial event.
As we've been talking, I've been thinking about Burchard's account and how, even if it's exaggerated, it shows this fascination with scandal and the darker side of human nature.
It does, doesn't it? And that hasn't gone away over the centuries. Think about all the books and movies and TV shows that still focus on the Borgias and other powerful figures from history.
It seems like we're drawn to these stories of excess and intrigue and transgression.
Maybe it's because these stories let us explore the limits of morality, to confront our own fascination with power and how it can corrupt people. They give us a peek into the darker side of humanity, both repelling and captivating us at the same time.
It's like the Banquet of Chestnuts, with all its salacious details and moral ambiguity. It's like a mirror. It reflects back to us our own fascination with things that are forbidden and transgressive.
That's a really thought-provoking idea, isn't it? Why are we even centuries later still so captivated by these stories of scandal and intrigue? What does it tell us about ourselves?
It's definitely a question worth thinking about.
Yeah.
And maybe by digging deeper into these historical events, by examining why people did what they did and what their experiences were, we can understand not just the past, but also our own fascinations and anxieties today.
It's a journey of discovery, right? A journey that takes us through the halls of power, the complexities of human relationships, and that enduring allure of the forbidden.
And speaking of forbidden, there's another incident just a few days after the Banquet of Chestnuts that I find particularly disturbing. It involves a farmer, his mares, and, well, let's just say it adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of the Borgias and how they behave. So we were talking about that incident a few days after the banquet, with the farmer and his mares. What exactly happened?
Well, our good friend Burchard, he documented this one too. He writes about this farmer who was bringing wood to the Vatican, and he gets stopped by the Pope's guards, and then the farmer's mares are taken into the courtyard.
Okay, I'm already getting a bad feeling about this. What happened next?
Burchard says they let loose 4 stallions into the courtyard with the mares, and well, it got pretty chaotic and honestly disturbing.
He says the stallions were attacking the mares, biting and kicking them, trying to mount them. It sounds really violent and cruel.
It's a pretty awful image. And to make it even worse, Burchard says that the Pope and Lucrezia were watching all this from a window up above, and they seem to be finding it pretty funny.
It's hard to imagine, the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, being amused by something like that, by animal cruelty.
It is, and it's kind of like the voyeurism we see at the Banquet of Chestnuts, this enjoyment of spectacle, even when it involves violence or exploitation. It seems to be a pattern in Burchard's stories about the Borgias.
It's almost as if they were totally detached from the suffering they were causing to those women at the banquet and to these animals.
It's a disturbing thought for sure, and it makes you question their empathy, their sense of right and wrong, and if they even understood the consequences of their actions.
We've been careful to point out that Burchard might have been biased in his writing. But even if we take his descriptions with a grain of salt, the main point is pretty clear.
I agree. Whether it's the Banquet of Chestnuts or the incident with the mares or all those other rumors about them, the Borgias really seemed to live on the edge of what was considered acceptable. They pushed boundaries and challenged the norms of their time.
And even centuries later, their story still fascinates us. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because their story touches on something universal, something about how alluring and dangerous power can be. They embody both the appeal of ambition and how that ambition can corrupt people. Their lives were just this mix of political scheming, ruthless ambition, and just living for pleasure.
It's like a Shakespearean play come to life full of intrigue and betrayal and scandal.
Exactly. And it reminds us that history isn't always black and white,
Yeah.
good guys and bad guys. The Borgias, like everyone else, were complicated. They could be great and they could be terrible. Their story makes us think about human nature and how seductive power can be, but also how dangerous it is.
So what can we take away from all this? What's the legacy of the Banquet of Chestnuts and the Borgias' story?
I think it's a warning to us that power, without a moral compass, can corrupt even the smartest people. But it's also a story that captures our imagination. It makes us question what we think we know about the past and maybe face some uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
It encourages us to really think about ambition and morality and why we're so drawn to the forbidden.
And it reminds us that history isn't just dates and names. It's a tapestry woven from the choices and actions and consequences of so many different people. The Borgias, with all their flaws and excesses, they're a part of that tapestry. They remind us that the past, even with all its messiness, still influences us today.
It's been really fascinating to explore the world of the Borgias.
Mhm.
It's a glimpse into a time that was both beautiful and brutal.
It has, hasn't it? It was a very different time than ours, but it still has things to teach us about human nature, the pull of power, and why we're still drawn to the darker parts of history.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
I agree. The Banquet of Chestnuts is just one small piece of a much bigger story, but it gives us a look into a really complex and interesting period in history. And by exploring what happened that night in the lives of the people involved, we've uncovered not just the scandal, but also those bigger questions about power and morality and what it means to be human. Questions that are still relevant to us centuries later.
Until next time, keep diving deep.